So I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for taking the time to listen to me today. So what I want to do in the next 60 minutes is to sketch a new challenge to the practice of explication. And I'll give you more detail as we go on. So I take explication to be one of the tools that we can use to articulate what I will call the manifest image and the scientific image, using what we could call the common sense and science, but I will use Sellarsian metaphors, the manifest image and the scientific image. I do not aim at textual accuracy. I don't exactly know what Sellars had in mind. It's not very clear when you read the text, but here is my best gloss at explaining what the manifest image might be. The manifest image is a regimented exposition of common sense. What do I mean by common sense? It's people's intuitive understanding of the world around them. It need not be invariant across cultures or space and time. So that means it might be historically influenced, it might be influenced by culture. So there's more than one manifest image on my view. Yet another aspect in which that's not quite what Sellars had in mind. It also can be influenced by science. I think one of the best examples in recent decades of how the manifest image can be influenced by science is the influence of psychoanalysis on folk psychology, right? For decades, it used to be extremely common to explain people's behavior in terms of their id and their superego, suggesting that scientific psychology had influenced people's folk psychology, right? So what I take the manifest image is common senses that vary across times, cultures that might be influenced by science. They might vary from group to group, as I said, but they might also be, and I believe indeed there are, parts of it that are universal, found across spaces, across cultures, and also across time. What do I mean by regimented in the gloss I provided on the screen? Well, the common sense or the manifest image without being regimented is often confused. It can even have contradiction or maybe at least tensions within it. What the manifest image does is get rid of this unclarity or confusion and expose it. So there's more to be said about the manifest image, whether it's a useful concept to describe common sense and so on and so forth, but I will bracket this question. And what I want to do next is move to the scientific image. So the scientific image will be described as follows. That's the commitments of a scientific theory at a given time with respect to what the world is like. Again, we should not really speak of the scientific image, but rather of scientific images. At any given time, there are many theories competing for describing how the world is. And furthermore, if you are a pluralist about science, for example, if you are a perspectivalist about science, you're going to be committed to the view that these theories are not really competing, but there are, in fact, many different ways at any given time to describe what the world is like, and that these ways don't really stand in a relation of competition. They're more complementing each other. Now, there's a lot of things to be said about the scientific image as there is about the manifest image. So, for example, one may be skeptical that scientific theories are really saying anything about what the world is like. If you have, for example, constructivist inclinations about science, you're going to be very reluctant to take for granted that there is such a thing as a scientific image or even scientific images. I will bracket against such concerns, and I will assume that the notions of a manifest image and a scientific image, or maybe manifest images and scientific images, are useful notions, or useful metaphors at least. If that's the case, then there is a question about how these two images can be articulated, how they can be made to fit with one another. And it's a bidirectional question. There are two directions of articulation. On the one hand, there is a top-down articulation direction. And here the question is, how should we revise the manifest image in light of the scientific image? You know, as science progresses, as we get a better understanding of fundamental parts of the world, how should we revise the manifest image? So for example, when we learn things about time and space, how should we revise our commonsensical, intuitive understanding of time and space? Or when we understand that the biological world isn't made of types, but made of populations that vary along various dimensions, how should we revise our understanding of the biological world, or intuitive understanding of the biological world? That a revision is needed is, of course, philosophically debatable. And one place in philosophy where that question has been well discussed is in debates around folk psychology. As you might remember, or many of you might not remember, might know, as you might know, back in the 1970s and early 1980s, many philosophers of mind or cognitive science and neuroscience argued that we should drop the concepts, we should eliminate the concepts from folk psychology and replace them with scientific concepts, right? People like Churchland and Stitch come to mind. And one response to this proposal, for example, by my colleague Jim Woodward, but also by Chris Hitchcock, was to argue that it's a misunderstanding of folk psychology to think that it competes with scientific psychology. And as a result, that whatever folk psychology says about the world should be modified in light of scientific psychology. Folk psychology may not be a theory, rather it may be a tool to coordinate ourselves in some circumstances. In that case, there is no top-down relation of articulation. I think that's a really interesting question, but I will not be focusing on that. What I want to be focusing on in the remainder of this talk is on the other dimension of articulation, where scientists are interested in importing manifest concepts, or concepts that belong to the manifest image, into the scientific image. And why would they want to do that? Well, one reason why they might want to do that is that they might be convinced that some manifest concepts capture important distinctions that any science should be able to preserve. Right? So we might think that some part of our intuitive understanding of the world just track important phenomena in some respect or other, and that any mature science should be able to track those very same phenomena. If that's the case, what we might want to do is to import those manifest concepts into the scientific image. So that's going to be the focus of this lecture of the next 50 plus minutes. One way to do that is to rely on Carnap's explication. Why would you want to do that? Well, despite maybe all their virtues, maybe because they capture some important distinctions worth preserving, it's still going to be the case that lay concepts or manifest concepts are in some respects or other confused or imprecise or niche opening and so on and so forth. Right? And what we will have to do when we try to import them from the manifest image to the scientific image is to refine this concept one way or others. And Carnap's explication has become one of the main characterization, one of the main gloss of how to successfully proceed in this in importing manifest concept into the scientific image. So what's Carnap explication? Well, I'm sure you've talked quite a bit about that in previous instances of this workshop. And as you know, there's been a lot of debate over the last 5 to 10 years around that topic. Here's one way to characterize it. It's a refinement, often but not necessarily formal, of lay concepts so as to make them useful for scientific and logical purposes. And some of Carnap's favorite examples are truth. Here he has in mind task-is work, probabilities, that's his own work, and indeed confirmation. There's much more to be said, but I don't want to get bogged down here on the details. The details of how we conceive of Carnap's explication really won't matter too much for the issues I'm going to be interested in the remainder of the talk. What I want to say, however, is that while we owe to Carnap the first articulation of this methodology for importing from, in a bottom-up manner manifest concept into the scientific image, that practice is part and parcel of science, right? Carnap did not invent the practice itself. Carnap characterized a practice that has a life of its own, right? If you're remotely familiar with science, you actually have a good sense that in many sciences, not maybe in all, but in many sciences, that's actually a process that is going on, right? Scientists do import lay concepts into their scientific practices. So what I want to do today then is focusing on this aspect of the articulation of the manifest image and the scientific image, namely explication. And I want to introduce a new challenge to the value of explication. I will argue that for a class of concepts, not for all concepts, but for a particular class of concepts, explication is unlikely to be successful as a way of improving folk concepts. And as a result, it's not going to be a successful way of articulating the manifest and the scientific image and the scientific images. And I will do that by focusing on a common sense concept as a case study. So much of the lecture will be a case study, and the case study will be the concept of innateness. And once I've focused on that concept, I will try to abstract and draw some more general conclusions about the practice and the limitations of explication. And I want also to show that experimental work, the kind of things experimental philosophers have been doing on lay and scientific concept, is really important in articulating some of the detailed challenges that the practice of explication might have. I think what I want to show is that it will be very hard to really articulate the challenge without looking experimentally at a specific class of scientific concepts. So that's going to be a byproduct, I hope, of this discussion. All right, so as I said, much of the talk is a case study around a specific form of explication. And I will argue that this explication is for non-accidental, that any explication of this kind is going to be unsuccessful for non-accidental reasons. And then I will generalize at the end of this talk. So section 1 to section 5 has a case study. I'll say a few words about the project of explicating the concept of innateness. Then I'll start with a hypothesis about the folk concept of innateness, looking at the manifest image. Then I'll describe some empirical works that I've done with some colleagues on the folk concepts and then on the scientific concept of innateness. And then I'll argue why we should do without the folk concept of innateness and why explications of the concept of innateness are unlikely to be valuable. And then I will generalize this question to a broader class of concepts. Okay, that's plan for this lecture. So explicating innateness. As I guess some of you, I saw Frankie earlier, so I guess as some of you are aware, since the very beginning of cognitive science, there has been a very lively and sometimes nasty debate about the extent to which and the respects in which cognition is innate. Right? So you have, the most dramatically different position on the matter in philosophy and in cognitive science. So on the left of your screen, you have the nativists. So you have the arch-nativist Jerry Fodor, for which every concept except composite concepts are innate. Then you have one of the fathers of cognitive science, Noam Chomsky, according to which, at least in the early versions of his, earlier versions of his views, much of language acquisition is innate, depends on an innate structure. And then you have some of the leading cognitive psychologists like Liz Spelke, who has been arguing that much of cognitive development relies on innate understandings, what she called core theories, or on an innate understanding of the world around us. On the other side, you have the empiricists, as you would expect. The empiricists have a very different view on the matter. The empiricist believes that, in fact, very little of the mind is innate. Right? That development does not require a large, substantial innate basis. More recently, Kim Stanley has been defending an empiricist view, and before him, the neuroscientist Camille Smith has been one of the leading empiricists. So their views are sharply different. But what they have in common, however, and I'm sure you've noticed it, is that they both agree that the question is a meaningful question. They both agree it is a meaningful question to ask how much is cognition innate and in what respect is cognition innate. And thereby, both sides of the debate commit themselves to the scientific value of the concept of innateness. They agree that genuine, valuable scientific questions can be formulated using the concept of innateness. Now, unfortunately, most of these debates don't really tell us what innateness means, right? How the concept of innateness should be characterized. And that's indeed one of the shortcomings of many of these debates. Philosophers have noticed these limitations, and they've taken upon themselves to provide what we should be calling explications of the concept of innateness, right? So they've noticed that scientists take a full concept, a manifest concept, and import it into the realm of science to theorize about cognition, but they've also been very silent about this concept. So what some leading philosophers of cognitive science and of biology have done is provide various competing explications of this concept. And here you only have a subset of these papers, but some of the most influential paper. André Ariu, the philosopher of biology, has identified, for example, innateness with the biological phenomenon called canalization. Richard Samuels, an influential philosopher of cognitive science, characterizes it as a primitive. So what is innate is what is primitive for cognitive science as a first approximation. Muhammad Halidi has another view of innateness. Elizabeth O'Neill has another view, and so on and so forth. Not all of them refers to their project in terms of explication, but some do. So, for example, here you have highlighted a sentence from Halidi's abstract, and as you can see, he refers to the notion of explication in the abstract to describe his philosophical project. This way of approaching the debate about innateness stands in sharp contrast with Lehrman's take on the concept of innateness. So Lehrman is, probably many of you don't know who he is a biopsychologist, what is known as biopsychology, a very minor tradition in modern psychology, but really worthwhile tradition. He's a biopsychologist, and you can see this picture on the right part of the screen. Lehrman was an influential psychologist, and one of the highlights of his academic career was a very intense debate with Konrad Lorenz. And you see a picture of Lorenz here. Lorenz, as you know, extensively used the concept of innateness to characterize both animal behavior and indeed imprinting, as you can see here on the picture, but also human behavior, and he had particularly in mind violence. What Lehrman did argue in a series of papers, forceful papers, is that the concept of innateness, the lay concept of innateness, is incredibly confused, lead to fallacy, and is so confused that it's beyond any repair, that there is no successor concept to be obtained by means of explication. Right? It's fair to say that despite his attacks, Lehrman wasn't very successful. And that he, in a sense, lost the war, and that the concept of innateness has remained very influential in psychology, neuroscience, and in other disciplines. But what I want to do today is provide you with a new argument for innateness, eliminativism, for Lehrman's conclusions. The argument is not going to be Lehrman's argument, but the conclusion is going to be very similar to him. And on that basis, to articulate a new challenge to the value of explication. All right. So that's the background, the philosophical and scientific background of the debate. Now I'm going to move to characterizing the concept of innateness as a manifest concept, as part of what we could call common sense. All right. So in past work, I've been arguing that the concept of innateness is part of a folk theory, meaning the way we understand spontaneously, intuitively, some aspect of the world around us. And it's part of what is called in psychology, folk biology. So what is folk biology? It's a way lay people, or people in general, spontaneously, intuitively, think about species and biological events. There are two aspects of folk biology that are relevant, and they've been found pretty much all over the world. The first one is that lay people think of species in a hierarchical manner, right? So there's a hierarchy. You've got subspecies, which are included into species, which are themselves part of genera, which are themselves part of life forms, and so on and so forth. And one of the ranks of this hierarchy is extremely important for lay thinking. And that's going to be the second rank here in the hierarchy, starting from the bottom. The one that's called generic species or ethnospecies in this work from Berlin, 1992. Why is that very important? Well, because that's the rank in the hierarchy where people are going to postulate that conspecifics, members of the same generic species or ethnospecies, share what psychologists call causal essence, or for short, an essence. And here I'm relying on the influential work of the psychologist Susan Gell-Mann. So Susan Gell-Mann has argued that for at least some concepts of biological kinds, particularly for concepts of ethnospecies or generic species, let people think that conspecifics come to the world with an essence that's inherited from the biological parents. And that's going to be determining much of what they look like, much of what they do. The type of experiment that Gell-Mann has been doing, mostly with children, but not exclusively, at the beginning, mostly in the US, but since then in many other places in the world, is to give people what she calls switch at birth experiments. So in a switch at birth experiment, you see an animal, for example, a pig, that is taken away from its parents at birth, and that is raised by another species, for example, cows. And then, you describe a bit the situation, the babies, the offspring only sees cows, and so on and so forth. And then you ask children what the pig will be looking like and what it will do when it grows up. And what you find out is that, as she puts it, children are essentialists, right? And by that she means that children believe that behavior and appearance is determined not by the environment, but by the intrinsic potential that's determined by their biological origins, right? So pigs that are raised by cows will be pig-like, they will do piggy things, and they will be dirty as pigs, and vice versa for cows that are raised as pigs. So the idea here is that species, particularly what cognitive anthropologists call generic species or ethnospecies, are viewed as having an inner nature. And that allows us to fix the concept, to characterize or to give you a gloss of the manifest concept of innateness. Right? So innate traits are those traits of conspecifics that are the expression of their inner nature. Right? So here's the idea, is that spontaneously we think of animals as having two types of traits. Those that result from the imprint or the influence of the environment, and those that are the expression of an inner nature that's transmitted at birth from the biological parents. Right? So that hypothesis about the folk or the manifest concept of innateness led us, me and some of my collaborators, to make the following hypothesis about the manifest concept of innateness. We hypothesize that when people think about innateness, they're going to think of it as having, they're going to think of a trait as having three properties. It's going to be species typical, universal if you want. It's going to be typical of a species, found across most members of a species. It's going to be what we call fixed, meaning it's going to develop independently of the environment. In all environments, the trait is going to develop. And it's going to be useful. It's going to have a function, what we call teleology, right? So innate traits on these views are those traits that are the expression of an inner nature, and those traits are going to be species typical, they are going to be fixed, meaning develop independently of the environment, and they're going to have a function. All right, so that was the hypothesis we formulated before the project. And then, because it's an empirical hypothesis, we decided to just test it, right? We decided to just find out whether this hypothesis is right. And that led to the following paper, The Vernacular Concept of Innateness, with my collaborator, Paul Griffiths and Stefan Linquist. So here's what we did in this paper. Again, here what we wanted to study was a manifest concept of innateness. So what we did, we gave people realistic vignettes about bird song, and we asked people to make a judgment about whether the bird song described in the vignette was innate or not on a 7-point scale. Right? So let me just give you an example. So we give some information about bird song. It's one of the most intensively studied aspects of animal behavior. Since the 1950s, scientists have been using recordings to uncover the structure and function of bird song and invested in great details, the areas of the brain, so on and so forth. All that is true. Then we give some information about a specific bird. The alder flycatcher is, let me just see here, is migratory neotropical bird which breeds in southern Canada and the northern USA. True fact. Studies on the alder flycatcher shows that the song an adult male produces does not depend on which songs they hear when they are young. So that tells us that song here is fixed. Studies also show that different males in the species sing different songs. The trait is not species typical, it's not universal. Furthermore, close observations of these birds reveal that the male song attracts mates and helps to defend their territory. Scientists therefore agree that the bird song has a real function, like the heart in human beings. It's functional. So we have here bird song. It's not species typical, it's fixed, and it is functional. And then the question is to assess whether or not the song of the male alder flycatcher is innate. Now, as you might have guessed, because we have 3 dimensions, fixed, plastic, typical, non-typical, functional versus non-functional, we end up with 8 different vignettes, right? We vary the relevant pieces of information. And in the first study, participants were presented with only 1 vignette and had to answer the question about innateness. To make a longer story short, what we found is that whether a trait is fixed or not, meaning whether a trait depends on its environment to develop or not, and whether a trait is universal or not, has a large impact on whether or not the trait is innate. Teleology, whether it's functional or not, has a small and somewhat unreliable impact on whether a trait is innate. We did replicate this study using the design, using a within subject design, where participants see more than 1 vignette. And again, to make a long story short, what you can see here is that we find the same finding. Typicality matters a lot for deciding whether a trait is innate or not, so whether a trait is found in all species. Fixity matters a lot, teleology matters less. Now, we were interested in whether the concept of innateness is best expressed in modern English by the word innate. And the reason we were interested in that concept is because we felt that the word innate is a bit old-fashioned and has a bit of a scholarly feature to it. So we wanted to know whether there are other expressions of modern English that are expressions of the same concept, and in fact, better expressions of the same concept. So what we did is that we did roughly the same study. We tweaked a little bit the vignette in some respects or others, doesn't really matter. And we used 3 different formulations: is innate, is part of its nature, and is in its DNA. We were particularly interested by the third one because, of course, being in the DNA is one of the expressions that in the first decade of the 21st century was literally everywhere. You might remember, I think, the Newsweek cover talking about the God gene, the idea that racism is in people's DNA, that religion in people's DNA, and so on and so forth. So that expression was used all over the place. And so what we did the same study, but sometimes asking whether the trait is innate, sometimes asking whether the trait is part of the nature of the organism, sometimes asking whether the trait is in its DNA. And as you can see here on the screen, part of its nature didn't really work. We mostly got noise from that study, suggesting that the notion of the nature of a species is not, the expression, the nature of a species, is not a colloquial expression in modern English. People don't really know what it means. We roughly replicated our results with innate. We got an effect of typicality and fixity. So the more universal, when a trait is universal, people are more likely to say that it's innate. When a trait does not depend on its environment, people are more likely to say that it's innate. We didn't get any reliable impact of teleology in line with the weak and unreliable impact of previous study. But what we found is a very systematic effect of the three factors for in its DNA. And that's a picture on the right part of the screen here that you can see. So our conclusion was that in its DNA is the best expression of the concept of innateness in modern English, right? When we want to say that a trait is the expression of this inner nature, we don't use the word innate really, but we use this pseudoscientific metaphor is in its DNA. All right, all that was as a way of background to the project and to the argument today. So the crucial part of the lecture is the one in this section before the generalization is the last section. What we were interested is looking at the relation between scientists' concept of innateness and the folk concept of innateness, the manifest concept of innateness. Right? And the reason is that it was very reasonable to expect scientists to think about innateness in a very different manner from lay people. And that's what we've been examining in a recent paper with Paul Griffiths, Stefan Linquist, and Carola Stotz. The paper was framed by two hypotheses. On the one hand, the conceptual ecology model, on the other hand, the attractor model that comes loosely from Sperber. The first one comes loosely from David Hull and Paul Griffiths. The conceptual ecology model starts with the idea that the concept of innateness belongs to the manifest image, is imported into sciences, not one science, and then gets to be refined intentionally or not to fit the theoretical and experimental needs of various scientists. So it's going to be imported in linguistics, it's going to be imported in psychology, it's going to be imported in developmental biology, and so on and so forth. And in each of these sciences is going to fit very specific theoretical needs, very specific experimental needs. And so the question, the hypothesis was that as the concepts get fit for local needs or for specific needs, the needs of specific sciences, it's going to diverge. All right? So we're going to have variation of concepts of innateness across sciences. You might think of that as trees of descendants, as an evolutionary tree. You have a root, namely the manifest concept of innateness, and then you have splitting as this concept evolves and gets to be fit across sciences in different niches. So that was the first hypothesis. If that hypothesis is true, we would expect variation across disciplines in the way scientists think about the concept of innateness. A very different hypothesis about scientists' concept of innateness is characterized or is expressed by the attractor model. So according to the attractor model, the folk concept continues to influence scientists' thought. So here the idea is that whatever your discipline are, when you ask to think about innateness, you're going to become a lay person, right? The folk concept, to use a metaphor, attracts your thought. right? It does not prevent you from, it does not allow you, it does not allow you to think about innateness in a different manner. You gravitate, so to speak, back to the lay concept of innateness. If that hypothesis is true, then you would expect you would expect scientists' concepts of innateness to be the same across scientific disciplines. Again, we have two sharply different predictions. They're both empirical, so they're easily to test experimentally. Now, before showing you the test, I should make a very important distinction here that matters quite a lot also for the general argument I will make at the end of this talk. And the distinction here is between two types of scientific concepts. What we call the effective concept and the efficient concept. It should be efficient concept here, not explicit concept. Sorry about that. So the the effective concept and the explicit concept. So what we call the effective concept and the explicit concept. The explicit concept, to start with, is a concept that is expressed when scientists theorize explicitly about a given topic. So, for example, the explicit concept of innateness is going to be the concept of innateness that scientists are going to use when they theorize explicitly about innateness. So when they write a paper about innateness, they're going to use this concept. By contrast, the effective concept is the concept of innateness scientists happen to use when they judge that something is or something is or isn't innate. Right? They don't theorize about innateness, they're not reflective about what innateness is or what the word innateness means, but they just use the concept of innateness. Now, in many circumstances, the effective concept and the explicit concepts are going to be one and the same. Right? Particularly for new scientific concepts, there won't be any difference. But it is at least a possibility that for some things, the explicit concept and the explicit concept are just not going to be the same. People will use a concept in their, scientists will use a concept in their everyday scientific life that is not identical to the concept they would use when they explicitly theorize about the extension of this concept, or the reference of this concept. Our hypothesis was that is that the case of the concept of innateness, right? When you read explicit work about innateness by scientists, you find one concept of innateness. However, when you look at the concept scientists happen to use in their everyday life, you find another concept of innateness, the effective concept of innateness. And what we are interested in is the effective concept of innateness, not the explicit concept of innateness. Why? Because the effective concept of innateness drives real work in science. So how to examine or how to study effective concept of innateness? Well, here's what you should not be doing. You should not look at scientists' own theoretical effort about the extension of this concept. So don't read what scientists are saying about what the word innateness means or what the concept of innateness amounts to. That's not going to be helpful to get at the effective concept of innateness. It's going only to give you information about the content of the explicit concept of innateness. Nor is it very useful to ask direct question. What do you mean by innate, right? To do interviews about the concept of innateness. You're only going to get them to reflect on what they mean, and you're only going to get access to the content of their explicit concept of innateness. A better solution is to do one of the following two things. You can look at natural occurrences of the predicate expressing the concept. You can do namely a corpus study. That's one thing you could do. Alternatively, you can ask scientists to use the concepts in an experimental situation, right? So you, instead of priming them to think about what they're doing, you're just priming them to just use the concept experimentally. And that's what we've done in this study I'm going to be describing in a minute. So we follow the two options. So our participants were nearly 300 scientists coming from 3 disciplines, biology, psychology, and linguistics, well balanced in terms of gender. Most of them were English. They were presented with vignettes that are very similar to the one you've read earlier when I talked about the Griffiths et al. 2008 paper. And here is a summary of the main results. On the left part of the screen, you see psychologist results. On the middle part of the screen, you see linguist results. On the right part of the screen, you see biologist results. And what should strike you is that they are identical with one another. there's really no difference whatsoever with the way psychologists, linguists, and biologists complete the task. And furthermore, they're identical to the way lay people complete the tasks. There's no difference whatsoever with the way scientists across discipline judge that bird song is innate compared to what lay people, compared to how people judge. Typicality matter, fixity matter, functionality or teleology matters unreliably in some cases, but has a very minute and unreliable effect. What we found again and again in study with lay people. And it's remarkable that it's not that scientists believe that the concept of innateness has no role to play in science. In fact, when we ask them, in your view, does the notion of innateness have any role to play in your field of research? Linguists and biologists totally agree that it's important, and psychologists and linguists totally agree it's an important notion, and biologists, while being more uncertain, still think it's a useful notion in their area of research. In addition, we failed to find a difference between people who are Chomskyans and people who are not. So having been influenced by Chomsky has little impact on the way you think about innateness. Nor do we find any difference between people who are evolutionary psychologists, for which the concept of innateness is central, and people who are just not evolutionary psychologists. So again, your training makes no difference to the way you think about innateness. It's just not important. What matters is the folk concept of innateness. So we concluded in that research that the attractor model is actually the best characterization of the folk concept of innateness. It weighs on the way scientists think about innateness and prevents them from developing concepts of innateness that would be attuned to the theoretical experimental needs of their own disciplines. All right, so that's it for the experimental results. I have one last section about innateness before generalizing to the issue of explication. So from that work, we concluded two things. The first one is that we should eliminate the concept of innateness. And we've put the argument in, we should eliminate the folk concept of innateness. The folk concept of innateness is not a useful concept for science. Why is that? Because it's a TONK-ish concept in the following respects, at least. It's going to enable you to draw inferences that are unreliable, right? It's going to be a wheel, so to speak, a wheel in your thoughts. It's going to move from premises to conclusions that are unreliable, and that transition is going to be unreliable. So for example, if a trait X is universal, if it's fixed, it develops independently of its environment, you're going to conclude that it's innate. And from the fact that it's innate, you're going to conclude maybe that it has a function or that it is an adaptation. But that inference is unreliable, since these three properties, typicality, canalization, which is a way of thinking about fixity, and having a function being an adaptation, are by and large independent from one another in the biological world. So you would be unreliable if you moved from one empirical premise to the next one. But of course, scientists and philosophers of science, cognitive science or biology, we're not that interested in using the folk concept. As we've in science, they wanted to reform the concept, to explicate it. But even so, we believe that it's actually not going to be a possible strategy. Why is that? Why not use the concept of finiteness and identifying with a distinct property such as canalization? Well, the reason is that it's not going to be practically feasible, right? So the reason here is a feasibility concern. Replacing the effective concept of innateness by means of an explication, should be here, might not be practically feasible. And why isn't it going to be practically feasible? Because the leg concept is an attractor concept, right? So any explications that philosophers of science, philosophers of biology, of cognitive science, and scientists themselves might propose of that concept will have little to no effect on the effective concept of innateness that drives thoughts, scientists' thought in their everyday scientific practices, right? So when a concept is an attractor concept, then it's going to prevent any explication to be successful. It's not going to lead to the replacement of the leg concept with the explication itself. So that's the reason why we think that the concept of innateness should be eliminated. The folk concept of innateness leads to unreliable inferences. The scientific concept of innateness cannot be the result of an explication, because the leg concept of innateness works as an attractor in thought. And that's what we take our work over the last few years to have shown. Now, what I want to do in the next section and in the next 5 to 6 minutes of this lecture is to move from the specific case of innateness and generalize to a specific kind of or specific class of concepts for which explication is not going to be a useful form of, is not going to be useful because of properties of those concepts. So the new problem for explication is a feasibility challenge or feasibility problem for explication as a method for transferring folk concepts from the leg to the scientific image. And the challenge or the problem is very simply the following one. When a folk concept is an attractor concept, so not all concepts are at stake, only those that work as attractors. So when a folk concept is an attractor, explications are likely to influence only the use of the explicit concept, of the ones that people use in their most reflective moment, when they theorize about the meaning of the words, the content of the concept, or its extension explicitly, but not the use of the efficient concepts, not the concepts that they happen to be using in their theoretical and experimental everyday life as scientists. And when the manifest concepts breeds unreliable inferences, then explication is going to result in the survival, one might say, of this, of the import, one might say, of these unreliable inferences in the realm of science. And indeed, I think it's very easy to demonstrate that's exactly what's happening in psychology and neuroscience with the concept of innateness. Scientists and biologists, linguists, psychologists often makes very unreliable inferences that we take lay people to be making. Now, it's a new problem for explication. It's, of course, it's a specific problem. So feasibility concerns are not new as concerns with explication. You know, you find that in many papers already in the recent literature around conceptual engineering. So Matthew Eklund talks a little bit about a feasibility concern. So does Stefan Koch, who I saw earlier here today, and Eugene Fischer has a paper coming out in, I believe, the special issue of Inquiry about also feasibility concern. Now, some of these papers have specific concern in mind, but other concerns are very vague and very loose. It's just a matter of whether it's possible to do conceptual engineering. Here, what we have is a specific concern which is rooted, and that's the second point, is grounded in two facts. First, it's a fact about psychological features of these concepts, which you might have understood I treat as psychological entities. And here that stands in contrast with the kind of feasibility concerns that others, such as Stefan, might have, which are in more semantic concerns, for example, externalism. Here, it's really psychological features of this concept that is going to stand in the way of explicating them, of replacing them by means of an explication. And so the second aspect of this concept that influences that makes them resistant to explication is a functional role. It's a role in science. And I'll say a bit more about these two things on the next slide. So it's a new problem because it's specific versus general or vague. It's grounded in specific features of concepts, psychological features of those concepts, and functional features of this concept, how they feature in science. And also, it's a narrow concern. It's not about concepts in general. It's not about explication in general. It's about explication of a specific kinds of concept, namely those concepts that are attractors. All right. And then the question is, when are Lie concepts attractors? When do you when do Lie concepts work as attractor? When is explication unlikely to be a valuable strategy? Well, here we don't really know, but what I want to offer is, as a way of coming to my conclusion, is some conjectures. And I believe a necessary condition for a manifest concept to be an attractor is to be part of a core theory, one of these fundamental way of grasping the world around us. I mentioned folk psychology, folk biology, and so on and so forth. Our typical, or folk mechanics, are typical examples of core theories. And I mean, it's going to be necessary conditions for a Lie concept or a manifest concept to work as an attractor. So concepts that are not part of core theory, concepts that we acquire by means of schooling, for example, are unlikely to work as attractors. So that's, that's in a sense a first point to be made as a psychological feature of concepts that matters here. The second one, second point I wanted to make is about the functional role of concept. When a concept is part of a theory, it's going to be working as an attractor when one of the following three situations holds. When it's not embedded formally or operationally. What do I mean by that? I mean by that many concepts, even when they have their roots in a manifest, many scientific concepts, even when they have their roots in a manifest concept, have a formal embedding. They are defined formally. That's the case, for example, of the concept of force in Newtonian mechanics. It has a formal definition. And when a concept has a formal definition, its life in the everyday life of science, both theoretical and experimental, is going to be determined by its formal embedding, by its formal definition. And as a result, the Lie concept will not be able to exert any pull on the way scientists think about the extension of this concept. Furthermore, it's not simply a formal definition, so some concepts are not formally defined, but they have operational definitions, which are extremely important and consensual. And when that is the case, I speculate that even when a concept is part of a core theory, it will not have any bearing on the thought of scientists. Here, to give just one controversial, one example, not very controversial, we might think of personality, and about the way in which personality has been operationalized in personality psychologists by means of the Big Five theory. And the questionnaire is meant to address the components of the Big Five theory. So when we think about personality in personality psychology, it's a very specific measure, which is operationalized in a specific, very specific way of characterizing people's dispositions. And that might prevent the concept of personality to influence people's scientific thinking, psychologists thinking about personality. Okay, another condition, another situation is when a core theory belongs to what we might call the explanatory gloss of a theory. So any scientific theory, scientific theories don't live on their own. They usually, and almost pretty much always, particularly when they're formal, but not only, they are accompanied by a gloss. And this gloss is meant to characterize in simple, often intuitive and informal way what the theory is saying. That's particularly the case when your theory is a set of formal models. When a theory is a set of formal models, it's pretty much always live or is accompanied by an explanatory gloss, and it's a way of communicating what the models say, including relating some of the variables of the model to something that are intuitively graspable. And when a scientific concept lives not in the models themselves, not in the formal apparatus of the theory, but when in the gloss of the theory and when it's part of a core theory, then we might expect that concept to work as an attractor. And the third situation that I wanted to make a conjecture about is when a concept is not explanatory central. Right. And here I have in mind what Kitcher had said about the concept of ether in the 19th century. 19th century mechanics, as you probably know, 19th century mechanics really relies a lot on the mechanical properties of a substrate, namely ether, that is meant to be pervading the world or the universe and explain how waves can spread. Now that concept seems to be central at the surface, but then when you look at any explanation that's given of any physical phenomena, what you find is that the concept of ether plays literally no role in the scientific explanations that are actually given by scientists. Right? So it's actually not an explanatory central concept. So the conjecture here is that when a concept is part of a core theory and when it's not explanatory central, it's more likely to work as an attractor. Right? So that's in a sense the type of situations in which I believe lay concepts are going to work as attractors. When in those situations, explications are not going to allow scientists to replace lay concepts by the explications themselves. As a result, lay concept will exert their often often problematic impact on scientists' thoughts. They will lead scientists astray. So that's the gist of the new challenge to explication. All right, to conclude, I think I can't do better than just cite one of my co-authors, first because it's beautifully written, second because I think it does embody some of the lessons that I think we should draw for the type of work, from the work I've drawn today. So that's a quote from Paul Griffiths in his very influential 2002 paper in The Monist, where he argues against the concept of innateness in science. Here's what he says. It is, of course, possible to define innate in a way that makes use of only some limited set of its connotations. You could identify innateness with fixity, and you could say that fixity is canalization, for example. But, Paul Griffith says, innateness is a term in common use, and one that represents a highly intuitive way of thinking about living systems. So it's a manifest concept, it's part of a core theory. This existing system of thought acts as a sink that draws new stipulative usages back towards the established use. It's what we call an attractor. Substituting what you actually mean whenever you feel tempted to use the word innate is an excellent way to resist this slippage of meaning. If a trait is found in all healthy individuals or is pancultural, then say so. If it has an adaptive historical explanation, then say that. If it is developmentally canalized with respect to some set of inputs or is genetically entrenched, then say that it is. If the best explanation of a certain trait difference in a certain population is genetic, then call this a genetic difference. If you mean that the trait is present early in development, what could be simpler than to say so? I think that's exactly the right thing to do instead of explicating the notion of innateness, instead of explicating concepts, manifest concepts that are attractors. We should just invent new concepts. All right, that's it for this talk. If you're interested, that lecture is partly based on the following papers. The first one published in Mali language. The second one is the philosophical transaction in the Royal Society B. And the third one, the one on scientists, in a recently published book on experimental philosophy of science. Part of the discussion also draws to some extent, but there's a lot of things that are new on chapter 7 of philosophy within its proper bounds. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Paul Sidney, who is at Paul Griffiths, who is at Sydney, Stefan Linquist, who is at Guelph, and Carola Stotz, who unfortunately passed away way too early a few months ago. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.